Money! I love it! Whoa, look at all the It's fantastic. Today we're going to talk about monetary policy because counting money is fun. This video will cover monetary policy. It is the policy adopted by monetary authority of a country that controls either the interest rate payable on very short-term borrowing or the money supply, often targeting inflation or the interest rate to ensure the price stability and general trust in the currency. The Federal Reserve Bank conducts its business by communication, such as publishing the Federal Reserve's Beige Book or open market activities. That's when they buy or sell bonds, reserve currencies, or commodities such as gold and silver. They can also change the reserve requirements for banks, but that seldom happens. But the purpose of that is to ensure that there's not a run on the bank. And naturally, they can print money, and lately they've been calling it quantitative easing. The international monetary system has had 5 stages throughout its history. Before 1875, the bimetallism was used. That's when gold and silver was used as currency. The traditional gold standard between 1875 and 1914, or the beginning of World War I, is a period of time when gold freely was converted and exported or imported between nation states. It was also a period of time when the world saw a great amount of international trade. Everything changed between World War I and World War II. It was a period of time when there was hyperinflation and depression in a lot of countries, a global depression. During 1941 and 1946, the Western powers was planning the post-war world, and it came all together in 1946 as a lot of countries signed on to the Bretton Woods system. The treaty was named after the location, the little town of Bretton Woods on the east coast of the United States. The idea was that the US dollar was pegged to gold as a reserve value, a reserve currency or commodity, and all other currencies was pegged to the US dollar. The whole idea was to maintain a stable currency that could be used on a global basis in exchange for goods and services. During the same time, they were looking at how to create a new world order that would safeguard the world from another disastrous war. The United Nations was created, the International Monetary Fund was created, and international treaties on trade and tariffs was also created during the same time. The US dollar became known as King Dollar during this period of time. It didn't have any inflation, and it was incredibly valuable. Now, other currencies could, if needed, devalue their currency, which meant that American goods became more expensive, but it became very inexpensive for the United States to import goods and services from other countries. The rest of the world found this to be a huge challenge. So during the Jamaica Agreement in 1972, they decided to leave the Bretton Woods system and move to a flexible exchange rate, and gold was officially abandoned as a currency. Now, gold and silver was never abandoned as a reserve commodity that backs up a currency in case they need to do so. Many countries decided to have a free float, such as the United States, United Kingdom, and the countries of the European Union, and even Japan, allowing supply and demand decide the value of the currency. Some countries decided to have their currency as a managed float. Such was Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Iraq during that period of time. Remember, Hong Kong was still a part of the United Kingdom during this period of time. Some decided to continue to have their currency pegged to the US dollar. But the interesting part is that some nation states decided not to have their own currency, such as Ecuador, Zimbabwe, Bahamas, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Panama, Cambodia, and so on. And lots of currencies have simply adopted either the US dollar, the British pound, or now even the euro. Some fundamental laws are still related to currencies today, such as GRESHAM'S law, where the least valuable metal would tend to circulate. So if you have gold and silver, people typically hang on to gold and trade silver. Now, that could be used even today, where there's major currencies like the US dollar, British pound, Swiss franc, Japanese yen, euro, Australian dollars, and so on. They will be seen as major currencies. And so if you're trading and you have either one of these so-called hard currencies, people tend to keep those while getting rid of the lesser of the currencies that they might have. Now, these rules were observed and meant that a lot of countries, when you were out traveling and buying goods and services, made it easy for people to convert currencies. They either had gold or silver, or they had, say, British pounds, but they knew how many British pounds 1 ounce of Troy gold will be valued at, and that way they could actually know the valuation of that currency. Now, during those days, they didn't have efficient machines to print an outrageous amount of cash, which meant that you couldn't devalue yourself out of a situation very fast. So here's an example where the assumption is that 30 US dollars equals to 1 troy ounce of gold. And at the same time, you could also convert 6 British pounds into 1 troy ounce of gold. And by using these two numbers, you could equal $30 is equal to 6 pounds. And to simplify that, then $5 will then equal to 1 British pounds. And that's the way how exchange rates worked. Or you just had a bag filled with gold and silver and used that. Now, the inconvenient part of gold and silver, especially gold, was that it was very hard to mine sufficient amount of gold to make it possible to grow the amount of world trade that the world was capable of doing. That meant that it was slowing down the ability for countries to actually specialize in certain areas. As a result, they couldn't export as much as they would like to. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, was part of the post-war planning between 1944 and 1947. It became the institutional framework with which international payments are made. Movements of capital are accommodated, and exchange rates among other currencies are determined. It was also during that period of time where they came up with the idea of fiat money, where it didn't have any intrinsic value, not backed of some sort of gold and silver, but indirectly was backed by all the abilities of a nation state to pay all debts, public and private. And we should not forget about the part where the government has the ability to taxation to raise funds. Now, although it's not directly backed by gold and silver, reserve banks do hold a basket of different currencies, gold and silver, just to back up in case someone gets concerned about a certain nation state and starts selling that currency and exchanging it for a home currency. And that way they have reserve currencies to actually exchange that the currency, because if you're a Federal Reserve Bank, you're the obligated party to actually buy that currency in case no one else wants to do that. And the last resort would be exchanging gold and silver for other currencies to back up your own currency. Bretton Woods was signed on by 44 nations, and as a result, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank was created. Technically, the US dollar was pegged at a rate of around $35 per troy ounce of gold. Other countries that decided to peg their currency to the United States dollar would have to keep their exchange rate within a range of plus minus 1% of the adopted fair value. So, King Dollar was simply the dollar-based gold exchange rate standards that we had for a long time after World War II. And it helped rebuild many countries out and about. Now, the European community, later the European Union, they were looking at a European common currency as early as Bretton Woods, but they didn't have the backing and political will to make it happen at that time. So a big part of creating the monetary union was in 1991 when the Maastricht Treaty was signed on, and it resulted in the creation of the European Union in 1995. And the key was the free flow of people, money, goods, and services. And, of course, the euro. It later created the European Central Bank, required a European system of central banks to get together and create and fund the European Central Bank. The idea is to set somewhat of a joint monetary policy, foreign exchange rates, and reserve currencies. Maximum inflation was 2%. And when the euro finally was started to become popular, so did the commitment of nation states to follow its rules. And that happened really strongly between January 1999 and January 1st of 2002, when the euro was introduced into people's bank accounts, shopping, and everything else. It happened overnight. Now, it was a very rigorous system, and it doesn't really allow the European Central Bank to print money like quantitative easing like the United States, and it didn't really encourage them to engage in open market activities like buying and selling bonds. And all of that resulted in a much deeper than needed crisis during the Great Recession of 2008 when banks failed. Since then, the European Central Bank has started a bond buyback program that started around 2015. They're still working on means to improve their system. That's why during March, the Federal Reserve decided to make an announcement that they will actually go out and buy foreign bonds from other banks. That meant that the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank would go out to the European Union and say, we can help you with liquidity. We can go out and offer to buy through the European Central Bank and other member central banks like the Central Bank of Sweden or Germany or France and so on, the ability of those central banks to sell the bonds that they have on their books, if they have any, to the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States. And that way, liquidity is created even for the European Central Bank. And it would probably do the same thing with the Bank of England, since they have left the European Union but were never a part of the Eurozone. Now, there's always currency crisis every so often. I happened to be in Russia in 1998 when the ruble fell from 6.3 rubles per US dollar to about 20 rubles per US dollar overnight. And that offered significant arbitrage opportunities. One such event was when the Mercedes dealer in Moscow didn't understand that the exchange rate had changed, and it took him like 3 days before he realized that he was selling a bunch of really fancy Mercedes-Benz vehicles for like $10,000-$15,000 when it probably should have been around $50,000. And that's kind of bad when that happens. So a big thing that happens during a monetary crisis is that short-term foreign debt to reserves increases, quantity of money, M2, coins, cash, and savings, that kind of just disappears. Panicking, flight to safety, people buy gold, silver, and other hard currencies. And naturally, fear is self-fulfilling, meaning that foreign investors would withdraw immediately all the funds and sell everything on the stock market and pull out of a country, and that causes a complete collapse. George Soros made billions of dollars on trading on currency crisis. So he's a good person to look at and study how he did it if you want to learn more. Here's an example between fixed versus flexible exchange rate regimes. If a currency would be pegged at, say, $1.40, and that's the exchange rate, and it's not going to change because it's fixed, and the demand is increased to over here, and supply will only be delivered at this point, given that price point right here, would result in a trade deficit. However, if you allow currencies to flow, the value of the US dollar will, compared to pounds, will go up to $1.60, and which means that it will naturally arrange itself to a higher price point in which demand will decrease and more people are willing to supply, and everyone will find a harmony where demand equals supply. Now, the alternative then for a fixed regime is that simply that demand will have to adjust to meet the new supply. And that's typically not what you want to do. Typically, a nation don't want to decrease the consumption. They like to increase the consumption, but they don't like to pay more. So the way we behave as rational beings is that we like to pay less and we like to consume more. But sometimes we don't have that opportunity, and therefore we will just have to adjust to what's available in the market. Monetary policy is fun, not only because it helps us to understand how the macroeconomic events happen, but it also can be touched in the form of different types of bills from different countries. And that makes it interesting. You can collect monetary policy, and it tells a story about a culture, a nation state, and could be an excellent memory. This pile right here, totally worthless today, but it used to have the purchasing power of maybe $20, $30, but now it's rendered worthless.